Chapter 2. Living on the Wild Side. He needed money quickly and wanted to get as far away from his so-called family as possible. He would count on his abilities to provide the money, and as far as the travel went, he might just be able to handle that on his own. One thing Mark wasn't, and that was stupid. He wasn't making a pouting little boy's decision of running away just to get attention. That was definitely not his style. His running away would be permanent, and his plans included being independent from anyone else except for himself. He had no false delusion of failure, and he knew that his powers would help him gain the freedom he had been dreaming of for quite a while now. He wasn't going to jump into anything, and he would think the whole thing out, acquire some money and take it from there. But first things first. He had to get money, and stealing it from an individual was out of the question. He prided himself on not wanting to hurt the little guy, and if he stole it would be from a big entity such as a bank that was insured and would hardly miss it. He wasn't looking to steal millions, just a few thousands to help him with travel and lodging. He was tempted to try the traveling part on his own, but thought about all the complications that might arise and left it on the back burner for now. He had to think it out carefully. He could easily lift a wallet out of someone's back pocket from the other side of the street, but again, he had to go to a bank or something similar. He didn't know if his strength was enough to actually rip a bank vault off its hinges, but he remembered that what he had done with the pickup truck, and knew he had the power to move mountains if he wanted to. The alarm shouldn't be a problem, and all he had to do was to simply cut the power to the building with a thought. That would be easy enough. He could force the doors open, and once inside, try his hand at the vault. His door opened, bringing him back to reality, and his mom stood there asking him to dinner. Telling her he'd be right there, he closed his notebook and tucked it in his little hiding spot inside the hollowed-out Bible that was a gift from his grandfather. He didn't think Grandpa would mind. He was a very open-minded man at the ripe old age of 85. Grandpa was about the only one he had considered sharing everything with, and he still might. Maybe Florida wouldn't be such a bad place to head to. He had enough Japanese food to last him a lifetime. Dinner was quiet and nobody bothered to ask him about his day, and he didn't bother asking anyone about theirs. Everybody had come to an understanding, and it was a pretty much you leave me alone and I'll leave you alone kind of deal. It was definitely not your Brady Bunch kind of vibes floating around, which suited Mark just fine. He needed space, and they were giving it to him. He still needed to find his own place as far away as possible. The whole living with his mom and stepdad was starting to wear really thin on his nerves. He knew he was still considered a kid by most, but he also knew for a fact that he could handle it on his own better than most adults could. He was glad to get back to his room after doing the dishes, and happily to get back to planning his first bank job. My first bank job, he thought, and smiled as if he was fixing to embark on a new career. He was simply planning on getting enough money to fund his new life and find something that he could do and be happy with. His age was another thing that could be problematic. Even though he was just 15, he was pretty tall for his age, and at about 5'10", he was average height for most adults, and he had even started shaving recently. He didn't have much growth, but he was still there. He felt sure he could pass for 18, and all he needed was the paperwork to go along with his claim. His friend Hakiro might be able to help him with that one. Hakiro was one of the few friends he had made while in Japan, and he had told him one time that he had a cousin that was pretty high up in the local Yakuza. If anyone knew where he could get the right paperwork to prove he was 18, his friend's cousin probably did. He would have to be careful on how to ask him for that, though, and he'd have to have some money to do the talking for him. He added that to the plans on the agenda. Again, everything revolved back to money. Money, it seemed, was the first thing in getting anything done. He wrote the list down, thinking everything through. American passport showing he's 18, driver's license, social security card, high school diploma, and a new name. So the next thing on the agenda then would be the bank. He had just the bank in mind, not too close to the base, and far enough to where the trip could be easily done through his ability. His alibi would be a good one, seeing as how he'd be up in his room asleep at the time of the bank robbery. The distance from the base to the scene of the crime would be the entire alibi he would need. There was no way in hell someone could travel that distance in such a short time. No one, that is, except someone that could fly like Superman, he thought as he got ready for bed. He told his mom he was still trying to recuperate from feeling sick, and he was going to turn in early. He got in bed and hooked up his earphones, letting the sound of Simple Minds lull him away from the strange and twisted reality he had found himself in. The next day was a Sunday, and having no school, he had the day to himself. He made up a story of going to the movies in town, and then hanging out with some friends and getting a nod from his mom, and a grunt from George watching the game on TV. He headed out the door. The Yokosuka Naval Base was located about 40 miles south of Tokyo, and the bank Mark had in mind was inside Tokyo itself. He needed to check everything out during the day, and made a mental note of all the cameras and power connections while there. He would be using money exchange as an excuse to hang around the bank to make sure he had the cameras placed in his head. He had a very good memory, and knowing their locations was very important to the success of his mission. He had to do this quickly, but didn't want to risk being spotted flying during the day. That would come late at night when his parents thought he was asleep. He took the express train to Tokyo and headed for one of the smaller banks in a fairly affluent part of town. He knew he stood out, but not as much as if he would have been in a smaller city. Tokyo was large enough to where a gaijin, or foreigner, wouldn't be worth a second glance. He was there about 20 minutes later, the train being very fast and very efficient. Overcrowding on local trains was a well-known fact. But the time of his travel was after the morning rush, and he wasn't as bad as it could have been. There were a group of teens trying to look tough, all leather and zippers and punk haircuts, and they gave him the stare down. He didn't rise to the challenge, and looked away and kept walking. Luckily, they didn't find him worth messing with, and he thanked the powers that be that he was the type that could easily be ignored. He wasn't bad looking, and had the brown hair and brown eyes he inherited from his mom, and at 5'10", with an average build, he tended to blend in pretty well. He could easily have wiped the floor with any threat of a pack of teenagers could have offered, but his job was to be as inconspicuous as possible and to do what he came to do, and leave as quickly as possible. He finally reached the bank, and after giving directions to the cab driver in his broken Japanese, and he told the cab he could leave. He walked inside and immediately went to the desk that had all the forms and picked one up at random in English and proceeded to pretend to be reading it. He then started looking at the various signs on the walls, but instead was busy making mental notes of all the security cameras, which were pretty easy to spot. He then noticed the open door that led to the vault, and he felt a tap on his shoulder. Startled, he turned and almost let his power kick in that would have bowled over the hand and its owner through the nearest wall. He luckily held it in check and cursed himself for being on edge. The man he faced was a Japanese man with a name tag and a big smile on his face, asking him in Japanese if he needed assistance. His Japanese language skills weren't down pat yet, but he was rapidly learning. He answered in return that he was looking for information on currency exchange, and the man smiled and bowed slightly and handed him the right pamphlets. He then excused himself and walked over to assist a couple who seemed to be as lost as he must have looked. He took another look around and satisfied they had everything he needed. He proceeded outside to look around at the building. He walked behind it and spotted the electrical connection, which was an electrical box on the wall that ran down from the pole, which seemed to be the only connection to the power that he could see. It was pretty high up against a very hard to scale building, and didn't seem to warrant any further protection other than its height and isolation. Satisfied he had everything he needed, he quickly jotted down everything he could think of in Italian, which he had gotten used to writing in simply because neither his mom or George spoke the language, thus ensuring that any of his writings found around the house would remain secret. He had already known the bank's location, having been here before with his mom, but he jotted the address down and detailed directions from the train depot. He walked back to the train depot and knew it would be different by air, but he had no intention of flying there. He would risk the flight late at night, but no further than the entrance to the city, and then would walk the rest of the way. Leaving, he just planned on going up as quickly as possible and using the cloud cover all the way home. It sounded good on paper, but it remained to be seen how well it would turn out. He felt safe in knowing that he had the perfect alibi due to the curfew that was in effect at the base after midnight, especially for someone his age. He decided to do it on a Saturday night, knowing that his parents sleep in the next day and he could take his time. He was also in the habit of locking his door at night and knew that no check-ins from either one of his parents would take place. He also knew that neither one of them gave a shit regardless to poking in their heads in his room and have a Brady moment of smiling and looking at their sleeping son. He was a bit nervous, but all in all he thought he was handling the whole thing pretty well. School on the base was a drag, and he seemed to slow down time to a greater degree than he liked. It was another one of the many things that Mark was running away from. The weekend finally arrived, and he was free at last to go through with his plan. Finally, he headed off to bed. Saying a quick good night, he locked his door and stayed up rechecking his notes and studying the diagram he put down to paper of the cameras in all the doors. Around midnight, like clockwork, his parents were in bed, and he waited another 2 hours before opening the door. He looked around and then closed it, locked it, and opened the window. It was a cool night, but he was ready for it. He had long johns and black jeans with a black long-sleeved hoodie and a leather jacket made for riding sport bikes, which was a gift from his uncle back in Germany. He never did get the bike he wanted to go with the jacket, but that's something else he had promised himself he'd be looking forward to. He liked his Uncle Steve, who was his real father's brother, and happened to live in Germany, working there as a contractor to the Navy. He always had a present for him, an encouraging word, which is a hell of a lot more than he had ever gotten from his stepdad, not counting his one night of bliss with a geisha. The way he became airborne came very easy and naturally to him. He simply did what he always had, which was to imagine an object being gripped by an imaginary hand made of power that moved that object like a real hand would. It was very simple to imagine the same hand gently enveloping him and moving him in the direction he wanted to go. The hand not only propelled him in the direction he wanted to go, but it was an extension of himself, and he controlled it like one would their own hand. In addition, one of its benefits was that it also kept the wind and a lot of the cold from hitting him. It was a bit like the force field that he had used around the house, and the only thing it didn't do was to provide oxygen and equalize the pressure at higher altitudes. He had no talents as far as materializing anything went. His powers were simply that of movement. If it involved moving, then he could do it. His practice runs were paying off because he was more confident with every flight. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, and hung there on the other side of the window long enough to slide it down, and then shot up like a dark missile towards the nearest cloud bank, high above. He had brought a very compact and very powerful pair of binoculars with him, and he scanned the well-lit base at the edge of the cloud bank, looking to see if anyone might have spotted him. He didn't notice anything, and satisfied, he stashed them back in the zippered side pocket of the large capacity backpack that he hoped would be filled with the goods before too long. He headed for Tokyo, staying covered by the clouds for as long as he could, and he was there in less than 5 minutes. He hadn't tested his full speed yet, mainly because he was careful to keep things unobserved, but he knew he could move pretty fast if he really tried. He found that the force field helped in allowing him to move quicker through the air, allowing for him to slide through it almost with no friction. This greatly added to the speed factor. He hovered over the train station and was pretty quiet at this late time, only one or two trains running, and no one in the immediate vicinity. He dropped like a rock and stopped himself a couple of feet off the ground to drop the rest of the way quietly to the gravel strewn around the tracks. Looking around, he didn't notice anyone but an old bum sleeping on one of the station's benches, and he went through the station to come out through the huge doors on the other side. Even late at night, Tokyo had its nightlife. It being Saturday night and all, it was still fairly crowded with people heading home from bar hopping and visiting the many houses of ill repute that littered the area. Tokyo was no different from any megalopolis in the 80s, and people here liked to party as much as people anywhere else. He walked by a couple of hookers overdone in makeup and had stockings with high heels and lots of smiles. They propositioned him in Japanese, and when he came close enough for them to see his face, he switched to English. He smiled and shook his head, pulling the hoodie a little further down, and cursed his luck having been spotted by the hookers. He was sure, though, that they wouldn't remember him from Adam. It was nowhere close to the bank yet. The trip had been a lot quicker by taxi, something that he definitely ruled out. He was starting to sweat a bit, and he blamed it on the thick hoodie and jacket, even though the temperature was in the 50s. I guess flying through the air made me break out in sweat, he thought, and tried to tell himself he wasn't nervous. After about 15 minutes of walking, he started recognizing the scenery, and the bank, looking a lot different at night, loomed up ahead. Traffic was scarce in this part of town that boasted mostly living quarters and a few businesses, the bank being one of them. He walked through the alley behind the bank and looked around for any witnesses. The bank was bordered by buildings on all sides and was a freestanding structure surrounded by condos and a couple of restaurants and a clothing boutique. The alley behind the bank had some sharded windows high above dumpsters and no lights on. So far so good, he thought, and looking at the cables running from the post high up to the building, he pictured a sharp pair of scissors slicing through them. He could see the lights shining under the metallic door of the bank with no handle, and after he mentally snipped the thick cables, there were some sparks and the lights under the door went out. There was also a light high above him on the pole, and he crushed the bulb with thought. He didn't try the door yet, but knowing where the cameras were located, he mentally snipped all their wires leading into the wall. He felt them being cut with his mental scissors, and was satisfied that they were out. He knew cameras and other equipment might have backup power supplies in case of power failure, and he was hoping the alarm system wasn't included in that scenario. He decided it was time to try the door, and he grabbed a hold of it with his gloved hand, and it opened quietly, anything holding it shut having been pulverized instantly with a thought. He walked in and let his eyes get accustomed to the darkness before proceeding. He flipped the camping light around his forehead to the red bulb, and having enough power to see by, keeping the hood low, he scoped out the cameras, none of which had the telltale blinking red light that he had noticed when they were in power. He then proceeded towards the vault, which was shut and locked for the night. It was an imposing door and looked a lot less so when it was opened and everyone freely going in and out of it. He noticed that there were no emergency lights that kicked in, which was a good sign, meaning that there might not be any alarms running on backup power either. He had no intentions of trying to force the heavy reinforced steel monstrosity open. He wasn't even going to try and test his limits on it. His plan was more subtle and included of simply probing it with his mind and breaking any mechanism inside one by one. He could feel the shape of the round long cylinders that slid into the lock, and he proceeded to try strength on each one individually. He smiled when he felt them being pressed with little effort, and after 12 of them were out of the way, he tried opening the door without touching it, but it wouldn't budge. He frowned and went back to work. He finally realized the problem, which was that he missed another set of heavy cylinders, that he finished quickly and tried the door again. This time, to his elation, it slowly opened and he went inside. He started to wonder what the authorities would make of the broken cylinders inside the door without any outside cutting, but he wouldn't worry about it right now. He had bigger fish to fry. He found himself inside the vault, which was a pretty spacious room, with rows upon rows of safety deposit boxes on either side, and a cabinet of sorts made out of metal at the far end. He knew he had to hurry because the lack of power would probably set off some sort of signal eventually, and for all he knew, there was live security monitoring the cameras that even now were calling Tokyo's finest. He quickly went to the cabinet and had a simple lock that he broke quickly and started rummaging inside. There were stacks of Japanese yen, and he grabbed some of the bigger denominations, but his eyes gravitated to the stacks of American dollars and all the bends neatly stacked and banded on one of the shelves. He unslung the backpack and started putting as many of the stacks of hundreds as he could on top of the yen. When the backpack was full, the stack was almost non-existent, and what was left he stashed in the side zipper compartments and a couple of final stacks in his pants. He left all the safe deposit boxes alone, knowing that they belonged to private individuals which he wasn't going to mess with. He wasn't about to steal some old lady's handed-down expensive brooch to satisfy his craving for wealth. He stuck to the plan and took what the bank's insurance would cover, and no more. He cursed, hearing a noise by the front door, and heard the siren in the distance. The gleam of flashlights could be seen through the barred windows by the front door, and he imagined it must have been security investigating the lack of camera feed. He quickly closed the huge safe behind him, not letting it slam with his mind, and the back door flew open for him as he exited. He didn't look around for witnesses, and simply shot up like a missile in the night sky, heading for the warm and cozy cloud bank as he was glad to see it. He hovered at the edge of the bank, knowing he was invisible by anyone below, and took out the binoculars, almost dropping a stack of hundreds in the process. He smiled at his carelessness and looked at the flashing lights and running cops far below. Sure enough, it looked like a private security at the door, and the cops joining them went inside. He wished he could watch the whole thing unfold as they discovered the broken vault door and the power having been cut. He would definitely be watching the news tomorrow. He gained altitude and shot like a missile horizontally, heading back to the base. He wasn't taking any chances and watched the place for a long time from the cloud bank before deciding to make a quick descent. As he was nearing the window, he almost had a heart attack as a couple of guards on patrol went by laughing and snickering below. They hadn't noticed him, however, over their heads as they went by his house. He quickly raised the window and went inside. His door was still locked, and he closed and locked the window behind him, finally breathing a long sigh of relief. It was good to be home, and it was going to be even better when he finally left the place. He could leave right now, as a matter of fact, but he'd watched enough movies to know that leaving now might make him a suspect. The wise thing to do was to act as if nothing happened, and to find a good place to stash the money until the time was right. It's about 4 in the morning, and the whole thing had only taken about 2 hours, with most of that time being in the bank opening the vault. The trip coming back was very quickly done, and he found he had enough time to catch some quick sleep. He laughed at the thought, knowing that he was too wired for sleep. He'd have to go to school the next day, and hoped no one would find the money while he was there. He cursed his stupidity and not thinking ahead. He had been too busy planning the perfect crime to think of stashing the money somewhere before coming back to the base. It would be too risky now to chance leaving and coming back, and he decided against it. He stashed the backpack in the back of his closet, it being too big to stash in his hiding spot, and then realized he could just make the hiding spot bigger. His hiding spot was a hole in the wall he had enlarged and covered up with some boards that made it look like it was part of the wall, after which he stacked up some old cardboard posters against it, followed by a bunch of shoes and old clothes. To date, no one had found it, and he was suspecting that George might have tried. He liked to snoop around on occasion, which made finding a place for the money a priority. He quickly enlarged the hole, trying to be as quiet as possible, and grimaced when one of the boards cracked. He didn't hear anyone steering, though, so he continued until the hole was big enough to put the bag back in. He put the extra stacks in his pockets in a small duffel bag and threw it in after the backpack. He then tried an experiment. He wanted to see if he could pick up the fallen drywall and try to hit it with enough pressure to make it adhere to the broken wall. He almost laughed out loud as he saw the broken pieces quietly lift and adhere to the wall one by one. He then pictured one hand behind the wall holding the pieces together, as the other in front applied enough pressure to seal everything, and mentally he smoothed it all out. All it needed now was a coat of paint, which was something he could easily obtain from the kitchen cabinet under its sink. He headed for the sink and found the small can under it, and digging out a paintbrush, he opened the fridge and grabbed a can of Sprite and a hunk of cheese, and quickly headed back upstairs. When he was finished, the wall looked intact, and as soon as the paint dried, it would be flawless. He smiled at his ingenuity, and looking at the clock, he finally hit the sack just 2 hours before having to get up and get ready for school. Mark listened to the storm that snapped him out of his reverie, and he was reminiscing of the good old days and his taste of the life as a criminal. That was a long time ago, he thought. He was a totally different man as far as staying on the straight and narrow went. In truth, he was the same person he had always been, just a lot wiser with a lot more experience under his belt. The power had gone out, and he put the fire out with the thought it being a bit too hot for a fire. He had turned it on more as a mood enhancer than anything else, it being pretty hot in Florida's middle of the hurricane season. Now, with the AC off, he was starting to feel it. The crackling of the flames and the sound of thunder made for a great mood recipe. He fell back on the couch and glanced on the ceiling fan, which began to turn faster and faster until it was going full blast. The air felt good against his skin, and he smiled even though it wasn't as good as the cold air coming out of the AC.